Mr. President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, we've talked about this recently more than we have in quite some time. Defending America needs to be our number one commitment. To many of us, it is and has always been. And that's why we've been coming down to the floor and talking about the National Defense Strategy. The Armed Services Committee, we have the honor and privilege of hearing from some of the really well-informed people, members and people from the outside, and they're looking, they see the threats that we are facing. Now, they don't always agree with each other, but I really believe that we're in the most threatened position we've been in as a country in the years that I've been here. And that'll come as a little surprise because people, they know that we've had threats. We've been at war for 2 decades, and we still have the threat of terrorism. It's out there. They've seen dangerous behavior of rogue states like Korea. I like the idea that the administration came up with. We're looking at our peer competitors. Our peer competitors are China and Russia, and these are countries that have actually passed us up in many areas. When I talk to the American people around, I go back to my state of Oklahoma, and when they find out that we have countries that actually have things that are better than we are. I mean, the quotes that we've heard from our various top people on the types of artillery that they have, that our competition has, then at the same time, not only do we have peer competition from China and Russia, but we also have the rogue countries that are out there, North Korea, Iran, and all of that. So the threat is there. It's a very real thing. So we need to have the answers. The Department of Defense creating the new defense strategy. This new defense strategy was one that I think was done very well. It did take into consideration the problems of countries that are peer competition along with the rogue nations. And I think it has done really a good job. Now, one of the things that I've really appreciated, we had a hearing about 2 weeks ago on the National Defense Strategy Commission that was put together. I've been here for quite some time, and I've seen a lot of commissions, a lot of reports come up, and I've never seen one that had, so you wouldn't even call it bipartisan. It's just nonpartisan. One of the individuals, Gary Roughhead, an admiral who is a co-chairman of the National Defense Strategies Commission, said that he didn't have any idea who on that commission were appointed by Democrats and by Republicans. It was equal Democrats and Republicans in the House, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, but it did come out in just with the very difficult truth that we had to deal with. And I think that one of the co-chairmen was Ambassador Edelman, and he said it was so bipartisan that there was no way of telling who appointed whom. So anyway, this is something that has been put together, and the commission report has a bunch of stuff that tells the whole ugly truth. It's an ugly truth to realize, particularly when you talk to people in the real world out there throughout America. They assume we have the best of everything, and to find out that we have a real threat. It kind of makes you go back and remember the good old days of the Cold War when you had 2 superpowers. We knew what they had. They knew what we had. And mutual assured destruction meant something. It doesn't mean anything anymore. But one of the significant individuals on this report was Senator Kyle from Arizona. And the reason I say that is Senator Kyle, in my opinion, and the opinion of many people, has been historically in the United States Senate and one of the, if perhaps even the most knowledgeable individual on the threats that we face and our capabilities that we have in this country. So it's unique that Senator Kyle was on this commission, because when he got on the commission, he was not a member of the United States Senate. He came back after the death of Senator John McCain, and served for, it appears to be, just a short period of time. So he has the unique position of serving on the commission and also being for many years on in the position to help us meet something that we haven't met before, and that is a real challenge. Now, Senator Kyle, why don't you kind of talk about maybe the Senate, the bipartisan nature and how this thing fell together, very similar as was expressed when we had our meeting, I think, two or 3 weeks ago of this commission. It's been very successful. I applaud you for your work on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President. I would like to thank the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee for engaging in this brief colloquy, and specifically for calling the hearing a couple of weeks ago at which the two co-chairmen of the National Defense Strategy Commission presented the findings of the commission report. And I agree that that hearing, attended by, I believe, every member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was a remarkable hearing because the members of the commission, represented by the two co-chairs, made it clear that their report, our report, was indeed a bipartisan document and nonpartisan, as the co-chairman Admiral Ruffhead said. Perhaps it would be good just to dwell for a moment on how this commission was created, and then we can talk a little bit more about the report itself, because I think one of the biggest factors about the report is the credibility of the people who helped to design it. A couple of years ago, the two armed services committees in the House and Senate put a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act to create a commission that would be comprised of 12 members, 6 of whom appointed by the Senate, and 6 appointed by the House. And they would be appointed 3 each by the chairman and the ranking members of the two Armed Services Committee. So there was a balance of 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. I think, and I say that because, like Admiral Ruffhead, I'm not sure of the politics of everybody who served on the commission. They all knew my politics. I was a retired Republican senator at the time, and I knew a couple of the other members of the commission, but frankly, the politics were left at the door. And we went in and debated about the status of our national security, and in particular, the Secretary of Defense's national strategy, and concluded, first of all, that the Secretary was correct, that we had to reorient the priorities of our national defense to reflect the fact that China and Russia now both presented a challenge to the United States that had not existed in the prior several years, but that are increasingly difficult to confront and important to confront because of the attitudes of those two countries. And that the other threats from Iran, from North Korea, and from terrorists, while still very significant, would be relegated in effect to a secondary position. We thought the Secretary's strategy in that regard was correct and commended him for that. And we also found that the basic strategy he laid out for confronting the challenges was satisfactory, but with a big caveat. And that was that unless the Defense Department was adequately resourced to confront these challenges, the strategy could not succeed. So much of what the commission dwelt on was what we would need to do in the near and medium future in order to rebuild our military to successfully be able to defend the United States against these emerging threats.
You know, that's one of the things that I was really impressed with on this report. You guys didn't hold any punches. I mean, you said exactly what it was. You said what areas. In fact, I have a list of the quotes that were in there, which I actually used on the floor yesterday, I guess it was, of the different members, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the rest of them, that showed very clearly that it's not adequately resourced, and we're going to have to do something about that. Now, I do want to ask what your recommendation was on the commission to do it. Where's that chart? No, that's not the one I want. Get the one that is, yeah, this is kind of a shocker for a lot of people. I mentioned that people don't realize that this is just one element of it that shows that China is actually passing us up, and by 2030 is going to have a larger Navy than we did. You and I have been in both the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee and have watched, and it's kind of hard to conceive that the time that we were always feared was going to be there is there now. Yeah, so, you know, when we are now faced with that problem, what kind of recommendation did the commission come up with to get us out of this hole?
Mr. President, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee is exactly correct, and you could illustrate the same thing with charts relating to our Air Force, with our Army, with the Marine Corps, all elements of our services. And it's not just in the number of ships, but in the quality of the ships. And both the Russians and the Chinese, I would note, have made some significant advances in submarine technology, for example, that will pose a real threat to the U.S. Navy. What the commission concluded was that 3 major changes were necessary to the way that we fund our military. The first is that the top line, the total amount that Congress appropriates each year, needs to be increased. We didn't specify a particular amount, but we noted that just to satisfy the 20-year budget projections of President Obama's Secretary of Defense, this would require a minimum of 3 to 5% increases annually above the rate of inflation. In other words, real growth in the top line spending. Secondly, and these are 2 faults of the United States Congress, the commission pointed to the Congress and said, you've been funding government for far too long with continuing resolutions rather than getting on with the job of passing appropriations bills that actually note each year's requirements and appropriates an amount of money to reflect those requirements. The continuing resolutions, or CRs, make it almost impossible for the planners in the Defense Department to plan more than just a couple of months in advance. And when we're talking about enormously long-term acquisitions costing billions of dollars, this makes a very inefficient way and an effective way to fund defense. And finally, we recommended that the Budget Control Act, which currently controls the way that Congress spends money, needs to have a change in it. The sequestration trigger in that bill has harmed defense spending more than anything else and has resulted in about $500 billion over 10 years in lost appropriations for the Department of Defense. That law is still in effect, and it will govern the appropriations of the last 2 years of the decade of its being in effect, unless Congress repeals it or modifies it. And so the third recommendation is that the sequestration trigger in the Budget Control Act needs to be eliminated.
Yeah, I think and that's been something we've talked about for a long period of time, but I think, you know, we have to recognize the problem that we have been in back during the Obama years, during the last 5 years, and this is a shocker when it kind of gives people an idea of how we got into this mess to start with. If you take and use the years 2010 to 2015, that would have been the last 5 years of the Obama administration, using constant 2018 dollars. In 2010, the budget would have been $794 billion. In 2015, $586 billion. Now that's a reduction of $210 billion over a 5-year period. Nowhere else in government did we have any kind of a reduction in any program, but that's where it really got into trouble. And I really believe that we will have to face this and recognize what the problem really is, and tell everyone what the problem is. Now, I say to my friend from Arizona, you've been active in nuclear deterrent, and you know we have not been so much. I can remember, and you can remember, back in the 60s when this was recognized as a problem, and I think the last time that we did any nuclear modernization was actually in the 80s. So long now. We have the triad system we've had for a long period of time. China didn't have it, Russia didn't have it, but today they got it. and they are actually have done more. We had a chart for this, but it shows what we have not done and what they have been doing. So in the area of nuclear deterrent or nuclear modernization, it might be a good idea to see what you folks on this commission were looking at in terms of that threat that we're facing.
Mr. President, and I certainly appreciate this comment of the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, because the secretaries of defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs have all said that our strategic deterrent has to be our #1 priority. And why is that? Because this is the one area where the entire United States security is at risk. This is the existential threat, the threat that could destroy the entire United States. Now, obviously, a nuclear war between either the United States and China or Russia would be devastating to the entire world. But because it is a direct threat to the homeland, it has to be the #1 priority. And yet, as the chairman notes, through our negligence, the administrations and Congress's past, we have allowed 3 things to deteriorate all at the same time, and the bill is now coming due on all 3, and therefore it's going to be a difficult proposition to get funded. The first are the laboratories in which our nuclear weapons were designed, and there was testing, and to some extent they have been modified or refurbished, and they have had their life extended through a program operated at our national labs. The national labs are in incredible need of modernization. You have a 1946 built facility in which our uranium is being produced. The roof is literally falling in. I've been there at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In Los Alamos, there is a great need to make changes, and we have to create a new facility for the production of plutonium pits. This is all highly technical, but the bottom line is that our laboratories are in dire need of refurbishment. Secondly, the weapons themselves, the nuclear weapons themselves, designed in the 50s and 60s and some as late as the 1970s, but built in the 70s and 80s, are in extreme need to have to be checked for their safety and their security, and to have their life extended by the replacement of certain components and making certain that everything else is in operating order. I know I was given as a souvenir a vacuum tube that was taken out of one of our nuclear weapons, having been replaced with a more modern circuit board. These are the kinds of things that we're doing to extend the life of these nuclear weapons, and it's not inexpensive. And third, our triad are delivery systems, the bomber force, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, and our nuclear-powered submarines that carry the missiles that currently represent part of our triad and our strategic deterrent, have all been allowed to deteriorate and need replacement at the same time. So instead of doing this seriatim, we're faced with a bill that is going to come due for all 3. Now, the good news is, through the good efforts of the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and others, provision has been made in the past NDAA bills to begin this modernization, and it has begun, but barely begun. And it's going to have to continue for a period of 13, 15 years, something like that. The other piece of good news is that while all 3 of these components of our nuclear deterrent are needed and are going to have to be paid for at roughly the same time, at no time in the budget do the combination of all 3 of these things represent more than 6.4% of the defense budget. And in fact, in most years, it's 3 to 4%. So for the most strategically important element or component of our national security, we're really spending a very small amount in proportion to what we have to spend on everything else. And that's one of the reasons why the committee, I think, has found it so important to ensure that all 3 of these things move forward on time in the right way, so that our strategic deterrent will in fact deter any potential adversary from miscalculating and thinking that the cost of of aggression against the United States is worth whatever they might seek to achieve?
Well, we've done a lot in the recognition of what is coming up, and I can't tell you how important it was to have this document. It's the first time I've seen everything written down so we understand it, and the unvarnished truth about the threats that are out there. So right now, we're doing we have this as the blueprint that we're using. We'll also be doing what we did this last year on the NDAA. The National Defense Authorization Act is one that has to be done and done in a timely manner, and we were able to do it last year. We're going to do the same thing this year. But when you talk about rebuilding the readiness, the brigade combat teams were down up to about 2 years ago, where only 35% of them could actually be used. Of course, the Marines and the Navy use the F-18s. Only 31% of those are actually flyable at that time. So we have a lot of that type of thing that is going to be necessary. You mentioned the triad. Yeah, that's a lot of people don't know what that is, but it's important that we now that both China and Russia know what it is, it's important that we do the job that we're supposed to be doing. Acquisition reform. I can remember the time that you and I both, the senator from Arizona, and I were both on the House Armed Services Committee, and at that time we were talking about acquisition reform. That was 30 years ago, and we haven't been doing it. We have now some really dedicated people who have a background in that, and we're going to actually try to get something done. But the main thing right now, I think, is going to have to be funding. We have to recognize that it's going to... It was interesting that that when you mentioned the 3 to 5% increase in funding over and above the amount of inflation, you stop and think about it. When we started out 2 years ago in fiscal year 18, we raised it to $700 billion. In fiscal year 19, raised the budget for the military up to $716 billion. And then the first budget that came out from this president for fiscal year 20 is 733. Now, if you do the math between fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 33, it's only increasing it by 2.1%, which isn't even inflation. So we're not at that level. We're not carrying out the recommendation that came from your commission and all those individuals who agree with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and everyone else who is knowledgeable in the field. So we've got our work cut out for us.
Mr. President, I couldn't agree with the chairman more. In fact, I applaud you, Mr. Chairman, and the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee for going to the president along with Secretary of Defense Mattis and talking about the need to continue with his defense modernization, and noting the fact that the improvements that you've made in the last 2 years have not rebuilt the military or even begun to close the gap. It's staunched the flow of blood. It's been like the tourniquet on the arm to prevent any more loss of blood for the military. But you are absolutely right, and what the president then said after his meeting with you, that he thought a number of somewhere around 750 billion was a more accurate number, is exactly correct. In fact, I think it would be a little more than 750 billion to represent the 5% above the rate of inflation, or 3% above the rate of inflation. I'll have to do the math when I sit down here. But the point is, some people think that the last 2 years, because you all were very effective, this is before I came back to the Senate, in staunching that flow above, that therefore the fight is over. Nothing could be further from the truth. Really, a 13 to 15 year program to rebuild our military has just begun.
Well, and I have to say that the figure that we're talking about right now came right out of this book. You guys did a great job, and my hope is that you'll continue to serve in some capacity, because we desperately need you. And it's been great to have you back for however brief a time. Nonetheless, we've accomplished a lot during that brief time. Thank you. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.